It was a quiet morning as the gathered mourners stood under the gray sky, listening to the priest's steady voice delivering a heartfelt eulogy. The air was heavy with grief, every word spoken a solemn reminder of the life being honored. Among the mourners sat Max, the family's loyal Labrador, his large frame resting a few feet from the polished coffin adorned with white lilies. He had been a steadfast companion to the deceased, always by their side in life, and now, it seemed, even in death. At first, Max appeared calm, his dark eyes fixed on the coffin as though keeping watch. But then, cutting through the stillness of the ceremony, came a single sharp bark. Heads turned, eyes darting toward the dog in confusion. The priest paused momentarily, clearing his throat before continuing, but Max barked again, this time louder, his posture now alert. Whispered questions rippled through the mourners, their unease growing. Max stood, his muscles tense, and began barking furiously, his gaze locked on the coffin. The mourners exchanged worried glances, some murmuring about what the dog might be sensing. The priest's voice faltered as his calm demeanor wavered, a subtle yet telling bead of sweat forming on his temple. He glanced nervously at the coffin and then at the dog, his unease becoming palpable. Max's barking grew more frantic, his paws scratching at the ground, as if trying to communicate something urgent. The air grew thick with tension, the mourners torn between confusion and fear, each wondering why this loyal dog would break the solemnity of the moment. One of the mourners, a man in his early 30s, stepped forward, his curiosity breaking through the growing tension. His voice was calm but firm as he asked, "Why is the dog barking at the coffin? Could it mean something?" The question lingered in the air, drawing uneasy murmurs from the crowd. The priest stiffened, his hands gripping the edges of the lectern a little tighter. For a moment, he appeared unsure of how to respond, his gaze flickering between the man and the barking dog. Finally, he cleared his throat and offered a hesitant reply. "Dogs. They sometimes sense things we cannot," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "But it's nothing to be concerned about. Let us continue with the service." The man, however, wasn't convinced. He studied the priest's face, noticing the faintest trace of unease in his eyes. The dog's barking showed no sign of stopping, each sound echoing with urgency. The man turned back toward the mourners, and then to the coffin, his brow furrowing as if piecing together an invisible puzzle. "No, this isn't normal," he said aloud, his tone growing sharper. "Max isn't just barking, he's trying to tell us something." The priest's discomfort became more apparent. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as he dabbed it with a handkerchief, avoiding the man's gaze. "I assure you," the priest said, his voice trembling now, "there is nothing unusual here. Dogs can behave strangely during emotional events." His words did little to quell the rising tension among the mourners. Some began whispering to one another, their eyes darting between the priest, the man, and the agitated dog. Max's barking grew even more intense, his stance rigid as he fixated on the coffin. The man, now resolute, stepped closer to the priest. "You seem nervous," he said bluntly. "Why? What are you not telling us?" The priest's face flushed, his composure crumbling further, as the man's question hung in the air like a challenge. The mourners fell silent, all eyes on the priest, waiting for his response. His hesitation only deepened the sense of unease, and in that moment, the atmosphere shifted. It was no longer just a funeral. It had become the beginning of something far more unsettling. The dog's relentless barking continued to echo across the cemetery, growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. The tension among the mourners was palpable now, a wave of unease rippling through the crowd. The man who had questioned the priest stepped forward once again, his voice steady but insistent. "Open the coffin," he demanded, his gaze fixed on the priest. Gasps and murmurs erupted from the group, shock and hesitation spreading like wildfire. The priest immediately shook his head, his expression shifting from unease to outright panic. "That's not appropriate," he stammered, his voice faltering. "It is against protocol. We must respect the deceased. The man didn't back down. Respect is one thing, but this? He gestured toward Max, whose barks had taken on a desperate edge. This dog knows something, and I'm not leaving until we find out what. The mourners exchanged uncertain glances, their confusion turning to suspicion. A few of them began nodding, their concern outweighing their hesitation. He's right, a woman said quietly. This isn't normal. The priest's protests grew more frantic, his words spilling out in a desperate attempt to regain control. Please, you must trust me, he pleaded. This is a sacred moment. Interrupting it would be disrespectful. But his words only fueled the crowd's suspicion. The man took a step closer, his tone hardening. If there's nothing to hide, then why are you so afraid? The priest's face turned pale, his hands trembling as he clutched at his robes. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The man turned to the family members of the deceased, his voice softer now. This isn't easy for any of us, but I think we need to know the truth. For them. For all of us. The family exchanged hesitant looks before nodding in reluctant agreement. An undertaker was called forward, his hands shaking as he approached the coffin. The mourners gathered in a tight circle, their breaths held as the lid was slowly pried open. A collective gasp filled the air, followed by stunned silence. The coffin was empty. The mourners froze, their eyes darting between the open coffin, the priest, and Max, who had suddenly stopped barking, his gaze still locked on the now exposed interior. The priest staggered back a step, his face drained of all color. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire, each voice laced with disbelief and fear. The man turned back to the priest, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Explain this," he demanded. But the priest could only stammer, his words dissolving into incoherent fragments. The once orderly funeral had descended into a maelstrom of confusion, suspicion, and unanswered questions, leaving everyone to wonder what dark secrets lay buried alongside the missing body. The crowd stood frozen, their shock at the empty coffin quickly giving way to a mix of anger and fear. The man who had pushed to open it turned to the priest, his voice sharp and unyielding. "You knew," he said accusingly. "You knew something wasn't right, didn't you?" The priest opened his mouth to respond, but only stammered, his gaze darting nervously between the mourners and the ground. I didn't," he began, but the words caught in his throat. Max let out a low growl, breaking the tense silence. His attention shifted from the coffin to a figure in the crowd, a man standing near the back. The dog's growl deepened, his body rigid as he stared intently at the individual. All eyes followed Max's gaze to the man, who now looked visibly uncomfortable. He took a small step backward, his face pale under the scrutiny. The man who had been leading the charge pointed toward him. "You," he said firmly. "Who are you? And why does the dog seem so fixated on you?" The figure hesitated, his eyes darting toward the cemetery gates as though calculating an escape. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly, his voice trembling. But Max barked loudly, stepping toward him, his stance protective and aggressive. The priest, now visibly shaken, tried to interject, his voice cracking. "Please, everyone, calm down. There's no need for accusations." But his attempt to regain control failed as the man in the crowd turned and tried to walk away. Max lunged forward, barking furiously, and the first man grabbed the retreating figure by the arm, spinning him around. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice laced with determination. The crowd began closing in, their collective unease now directed at the stranger. "Tell us the truth," the man demanded. "What do you know about the missing body?" The stranger's composure cracked. His hands trembled, and beads of sweat formed on his forehead. I didn't want to be a part of this," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. The man pressed further. "A part of what? What's going on here?" The stranger hesitated, his eyes darting from the coffin to the priest. Finally, with a deep, shuddering breath, he confessed. The body. It's not here because it was taken, he admitted. Gasps erupted from the mourners, their shock intensifying. I was paid to help. Someone wanted it gone, but I swear, I don't know why. The priest's knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the steps of the podium, his head in his hands. The mourners erupted into a mix of outrage and confusion, their voices overlapping in a chaotic storm of questions and accusations. The man, now trembling, pointed toward the priest. He knew, he said. He knew the body wasn't there. The crowd turned on the priest, their disbelief turning into anger. Is this true? Someone shouted. The priest raised his head, tears in his eyes. I was told to go along with it, he admitted in a broken voice. I didn't know what else to do. I was afraid. As the crowd struggled to process the shocking revelation, Max finally sat down, his barking replaced by a calm but watchful gaze. The dog's instincts had led them to uncover the truth, but the answers raised even more questions. Who had taken the body, and why? The mourners knew this was far from over, and the dark mystery surrounding the funeral was only beginning to unravel. The cemetery was filled with murmurs of disbelief and anger, the mourners now grappling with the shocking revelation. The priest, still slumped on the steps, looked utterly defeated, while the man who had confessed to helping steal the body stood frozen in fear. The man who had demanded the truth stepped forward again, his voice steady but cold. Who paid you? He asked, fixing the stranger with an intense gaze. And why would they want the body? The stranger hesitated, his eyes darting around the crowd as though searching for an escape. I don't know who they were, he stammered. It was a man in a suit. He offered me money, a lot of money, to make sure the body disappeared before the funeral. His voice cracked as he continued. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know. A wave of outrage rippled through the mourners, and someone shouted, That's not good enough. We need answers. The stranger flinched but quickly added, The man said something strange. He said it was for protection, that the body couldn't stay here. His words sent a chill through the group, their confusion deepening. Protection from what? Someone demanded, their voice trembling. Max, still sitting near the coffin, let out a low growl, drawing everyone's attention once more. The dog's gaze shifted to a spot near the edge of the cemetery, where the thick mist seemed to swirl unnaturally. The mourners turned to look, their unease growing as a shadowy figure emerged from the fog. The figure moved slowly, their face obscured by the mist, but their presence was enough to send a shiver down everyone's spine. The man who had been leading the questioning stepped closer to the stranger. Is that him? He asked, his voice low but firm. The stranger's face went pale, and he nodded, his trembling hands clutching at his sides. That's him, he whispered. The mourners watched in stunned silence as the figure came to a stop just outside the circle of the crowd. They couldn't make out his features, but his voice was clear, cutting through the still air like a knife. You shouldn't have opened the coffin, he said, his tone calm but chilling. You've made a mistake. The crowd recoiled at his words, fear rippling through them like a wave. The man stepped forward, confronting the figure despite the tension in the air. What have you done with the body? He demanded. And why was it taken? The figure didn't move, his stance eerily calm. The body wasn't safe here, he said simply. There are things you don't understand, things that are better left undisturbed. I took it to protect everyone. The man didn't back down, his frustration and fear bubbling to the surface. Protect us from what? He shouted. Tell us the truth. The figure took a step closer, the mist swirling around him like a living thing. You've already seen the signs, he said cryptically. The dog knew. It always knows. But you were not supposed to interfere. Before anyone could respond, the figure turned and walked back into the mist, disappearing as suddenly as he had appeared. The crowd was left in stunned silence, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. The mourners looked at each other, their faces pale with fear and uncertainty. Max let out a soft whimper, lying down beside the coffin as if exhausted from his efforts. The man who had led the charge turned back to the priest, his expression grim. "There's more to this than we thought," he said quietly, "and we're not done yet." The mourners began to disperse, their quiet murmurs filling the air as they left the cemetery with more questions than answers. The truth about what had happened and what it all meant remained hidden in the mist, waiting to be uncovered. The days that followed the funeral were filled with tension and unanswered questions. The story of the empty coffin and the mysterious figure spread quickly through the town, fueling speculation and fear. People whispered about ancient curses, stolen identities, and unspoken family secrets, each theory more chilling than the last. Yet, despite the growing unease, no one could deny that something deeply unsettling had occurred. The man who had taken charge at the funeral couldn't let it go. Sitting in his dimly lit living room, surrounded by stacks of books and newspaper clippings, he pored over every detail he could find about the deceased and the strange events of that day. His laptop glowed softly on the desk, displaying articles about local legends and unexplained disappearances. Max sat nearby, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes were watchful, as if he too sensed the gravity of what they were uncovering. One evening, as the man was deep in thought, there was a knock at his door. Startled, he glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. He hesitated before opening the door, his breath catching as he saw the priest standing there, his face pale and his eyes hollow. "I need to talk to you," the priest said, his voice trembling. "There's something you need to know." The man let him in, and the priest wasted no time. "I didn't tell you everything at the funeral," he admitted, his hands shaking as he clasped them together. "Years ago, there was a similar incident in this town. A body vanished during a funeral, and no one could explain why. The only connection was that dog." He glanced at Max, who lifted his head, his ears pricking up at the mention of the past. The man frowned, leaning forward. "Max, what are you saying?" The priest nodded, his expression grim. Not Max specifically, but his bloodline. The family always kept a dog like him, and they always knew when something was wrong. Some say the dogs are protectors, guarding against things we can't understand. The man's heart raced as the pieces began to click into place. "Protectors from what?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The priest hesitated before responding. "There's a legend," he said slowly, "about spirits that roam these lands. They're drawn to certain people, certain families. The dogs can sense them, and when they appear, it's a warning." Before the man could press further, Max let out a low growl, his gaze fixed on the window. Both men turned to look, their blood running cold as they saw a shadowy figure standing in the yard, barely visible in the dim moonlight. The figure didn't move, but its presence was enough to fill the room with an almost suffocating dread. The priest stood abruptly, his face etched with fear. "It's here," he whispered. "It knows we're asking questions." The man moved toward the window, but the priest grabbed his arm. "Don't," he warned. "If you acknowledge it, you give it power." The tension in the room was unbearable as Max continued to growl, his body tense and ready to spring into action. The man swallowed hard, his mind racing with questions. "What does it want?" he asked, his voice trembling. The priest shook his head. "It's not about what it wants," he said, his voice grave. "It's about what it's protecting. Something was taken that shouldn't have been, and now the balance is broken." As the figure outside began to dissolve into the night, the priest turned to the man with a desperate look. "You need to stop digging," he said. "Some truths are better left buried." But the man couldn't shake the feeling that the mystery was far from over, and that the answers he sought would come at a price. Max let out a soft bark, his eyes gleaming with determination, as if urging his owner to press on. The man knew one thing for sure. Whatever lay ahead, he couldn't turn back now. The next day, The man couldn't shake the haunting images of the figure in the yard. The priest's warnings echoed in his mind, but his curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of urgency, pushed him forward. There was no way he could stop now. Something was deeply wrong, and he needed to understand what it was. Max seemed to share his resolve, never straying far from his side, his alert eyes always watching, as though sensing the next steps of the mystery that loomed ahead. Determined to get to the bottom of it, the man revisited the cemetery where the funeral had taken place. The scene from days earlier replayed in his mind: Max barking at the coffin, the priest's nervousness, the strange figure who had appeared out of the mist. He stood at the edge of the cemetery, his heart pounding, as he tried to make sense of it all. The place felt different now, empty in a way that wasn't just about the absence of people. There was an oppressive weight in the air, like the land itself was holding its breath. Max stood beside him, his body tense, ears perked. The man knelt down beside the dog, placing a hand on his back. "I know you're trying to tell me something," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Max looked up at him, then turned his gaze to a small, weathered gravestone in the distance. The man followed his line of sight and felt a chill run down his spine. The gravestone was old, far older than any of the others in the cemetery, and it stood at the edge of the property, hidden behind a cluster of trees. Something about it felt significant, as if it held the key to everything. Without hesitation, the man stood and walked toward it, Max following close behind. As they approached the gravestone, the air grew colder, the weight of something unseen pressing in. The stone was cracked, its inscription almost unreadable, but the man could make out a few words. "Here lies the protector of the forgotten." Confusion washed over him. What did it mean? He knelt down to get a closer look, but just as his fingers brushed the surface of the stone, a voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here." The man spun around to find the priest standing behind him, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "What are you doing here?" the man asked, his heart racing. The priest stepped forward slowly, his hands clasped together tightly. "I told you, some things are better left alone," he said, his voice strained. "The body that was taken, it was never meant to stay in the ground. That gravestone is the key. It marks the boundary between this world and the next." The man frowned, trying to piece it all together. "The next? What are you talking about?" The priest's eyes darted nervously toward the stone. "The dog. Max's bloodline. They've always guarded it. That body wasn't just anyone's. It was tied to something much darker. And now, the balance is broken. The figure you saw in the mist. It's a guardian of sorts, trying to stop you from learning the truth." Max growled low, his gaze fixed on the priest. The man felt a shiver run down his spine as he looked at the dog, then back at the priest. "Why didn't you tell me all of this before? Why didn't you warn me?" The priest shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "I was afraid. If you knew what I knew, you would never have come here. You wouldn't have uncovered the secret that's been buried for generations." The man clenched his fists, frustration rising within him. "What secret? What is this about?" The priest took a deep breath, his voice cracking as he spoke. "The body that was taken belonged to someone who was never meant to die. It was someone with a dark past, someone whose death was only an illusion. And now that illusion is unraveling. The figure in the mist? It's trying to protect us from what comes next. But there's no stopping it now. The truth is out, and it won't rest until it's been fully revealed." The man stared at him in shock. "Are you saying the body was faked, and the death was a lie?" The priest nodded grimly. "Yes, and now something is waking up, something that shouldn't be disturbed." Max barked sharply, interrupting the conversation, his body stiff with tension. The man turned to look at him, then back at the priest. "We need to finish this. We need to find the answers before it's too late." The priest lowered his head, his voice barely a whisper. "I hope you're ready for what's coming. Once you cross the line, there's no turning back. With those words, the man knew that whatever lay ahead, he had to confront it. The mystery was no longer just about a missing body or strange happenings. It was about something far bigger, and it was up to him to uncover the truth before it was lost forever.